am a 27-year-old woman, and I have been engaged to my 17-year-old fiancé for quite some time. We have lived together for the past 2 years, but our relationship actually goes back much further. Before moving in together, we dated on and off for almost 5 years. Like many couples, we had our ups and downs, but I always believed that, eventually, we would build a happy and stable life together. Instead, I now feel completely overwhelmed, emotionally drained, and honestly close to giving up. For the past 1.5 years, my frustration has been growing little by little. I kept hoping things would improve, but they never really did. Every conversation about our future ends with promises that are quickly forgotten. Now, everything feels like it has reached a breaking point. I work a demanding full-time job that barely pays enough to cover our bills. My salary keeps a roof over our heads, pays for food, utilities, internet, and every other expense we have. Even though I work full-time, we still live paycheck to paycheck because I am supporting both of us on a single income. My job is exhausting. By the time I get home each evening, I am physically and mentally worn out. All I want is to relax for a little while, but instead I walk into a house that is often messy, with chores left undone and responsibilities ignored. When my fiancé moved across the country to live with me, we agreed on something very simple. He would find at least a part-time job so that we could share the financial responsibilities. We weren't expecting luxury. We just wanted enough money to stop struggling every month and maybe save a little for our future. Unfortunately, that never happened. It has now been more than 1.5 years, and we still have absolutely no savings. According to him, he has been looking for work this entire time. Technically, that is true because I have seen him send out a few job applications. But after 18 months, only getting a handful of interviews simply isn't enough. It doesn't feel like he is putting in real effort. Throughout his life, he has never managed to keep a job for longer than a year. His education stopped after earning a high school equivalency diploma, and ever since I have known him, he has constantly changed his mind about what career he wants. One week he wants one thing, the next week he wants something completely different. I tried to support him instead of criticizing him. I spent hours helping him brainstorm career ideas and explore different options. Every time we talked, he seemed to agree with whatever I suggested, but later I realized he was only telling me what he thought I wanted to hear. For a while, he insisted that he wanted to study information technology because it seemed practical. Later, he admitted that he never truly wanted that career. He only thought maybe he could force himself to like it. Even when he claimed to be researching colleges and training programs, he wasn't seriously doing anything. Eventually, I became so frustrated that I sat him down for a serious conversation. I told him that pretending to search for careers wasn't helping either of us. I asked him to take 2 weeks to honestly think about what he wanted from life. I wanted him to choose something that genuinely interested him instead of picking random ideas just to end the conversation. After a lot of encouragement, he finally decided that he wanted to become a YouTuber. It wasn't the career path I expected, but I didn't dismiss it. Plenty of people earn a living through online content, and he even had friends who were already creating videos. Since people had supported me while I worked toward my dream career, I wanted to give him the same encouragement. We invested in a high-quality microphone so he could begin making videos. In return, we made a new agreement. For 6 months, I wouldn't pressure him to apply for jobs. Instead, he would treat YouTube like a full-time job and consistently build his channel. Sadly, that plan fell apart almost immediately. He stayed motivated for less than a month before his uploads became irregular. Soon there were excuses every week. Some days he wasn't feeling motivated. Other days he claimed he was still researching other creators. Then he would say he wasn't ready yet. When I finally asked why nothing was getting done, I wasn't expecting overnight success. I never expected him to become famous or make money immediately. All I wanted was consistency. The videos he planned to make didn't even require complicated editing. He simply needed to record, check the audio, and upload them. Yet even those simple steps became too difficult to complete. Eventually, through many difficult conversations, I learned that part of the problem came from emotional abuse he experienced during childhood. He described feeling mentally blocked whenever he tried to move forward with important goals. I understood that more than most people might. I work with children who have experienced trauma, and I have spent years studying how childhood experiences affect mental health. I have also dealt with my own emotional struggles, so I genuinely wanted to be patient. I believed healing takes time, and I didn't want to judge him unfairly. But weeks turned into months, and nothing changed. He continued saying that YouTube was still his dream, yet almost no progress was made. Whenever I asked what he had accomplished, he usually replied that he had spent the day watching successful creators as research. At first, I accepted that explanation. After all, research is part of learning. Eventually, though, it became obvious that the research never led to action. Months passed without real improvement, new content, or meaningful effort. During this time, I also spent many sessions discussing everything with my therapist. Long before the situation reached its current point, I accepted something important. I could live with being the only person earning money, but only if my fiancé took responsibility for nearly all of the household chores. Since he stayed home all day while I worked full-time, that arrangement seemed fair to both of us. He agreed without hesitation. Unfortunately, very little actually changed. Day after day, I came home to dirty dishes, cluttered rooms, and unfinished cleaning because he said he had a bad day or simply didn't feel up to it. I tried everything I could think of. I helped him create schedules. I encouraged him to focus on his mental health. I even bought workbooks and self-help materials that I hoped would make things easier for him. None of it made a lasting difference. Right before Christmas, I reached my limit. I took vacation time from work and deep cleaned our entire home by myself because I couldn't stand living in the mess anymore. While I scrubbed every room from top to bottom, he contributed almost nothing, explaining that his foot hurt. I understood that he couldn't stand for long periods, but there were still many tasks he could have completed while sitting down. Instead, I received almost no help. When I returned to work, I asked him to complete only a few simple chores while I was gone, put away the clean dishes, clean the microwave, and wipe down the stovetop. When I came home that evening, the microwave was still dirty. Half of the dishes were still sitting on the drying rack. Others had been put away in the wrong cabinets. The stove had only been partially cleaned. Meanwhile, he was comfortably playing online games with his friends. At that moment, I felt exhausted, disappointed, and deeply hurt. We argued, and as usual, he became defensive. Eventually, we talked things through, and once again he promised that he would do better. But by then, I had heard that promise more times than I could remember. Just a few days before Christmas in 2023, something unexpected happened. My phone suddenly lit up with a message from Dominic. It had been a long time since we had really talked. Seeing his name on my screen brought back memories I thought I had already buried. We spent hours catching up, talking about everything that had happened since we drifted apart. It felt familiar, almost comforting. We both admitted that we had missed each other. At first, we agreed to take things slowly. Neither of us wanted to rush into anything. We promised we would rebuild our connection one step at a time. But that promise didn't last very long. As New Year's arrived, Dominic completely disappeared. No messages. No phone calls. No explanation. For days, I stared at my phone wondering what I had done wrong. Every notification made my heart race, only to end in disappointment. My anxiety grew stronger with each passing day. I kept making excuses for him, convincing myself that there had to be a reason. Then, without warning, he came back. Instead of protecting myself, I jumped right back into the relationship. Looking back now, I can clearly see how reckless that decision was. But at the time, I wasn't thinking logically. I was chasing the excitement, the butterflies, and the hope that this time would somehow be different. By the end of January 2023, Dominic suggested something that completely changed both of our lives. He asked me if we should live together. It sounded romantic. It sounded like the beginning of a new chapter. I believed that being together every day would make our relationship stronger. I ignored every warning sign. Only a few weeks later, Dominic packed everything he owned and moved across the country to my state. He didn't have a job. He didn't have a real plan. He simply believed everything would somehow work itself out. At the time, I thought love would be enough. I had no idea that this decision would become the beginning of one of the hardest periods of my entire life. As the months passed, reality slowly replaced excitement. Finding work took longer than expected. Money became stressful. Responsibility became one-sided. I found myself carrying more and more of the weight while convincing myself it was only temporary. After the events I would later describe publicly in early 2025, I became even more determined to save him. I believed that if I just tried harder, loved him more, or found the right words, everything would improve. So I pushed myself beyond my limits. Every day became another attempt to motivate him. I constantly reminded him to clean, to help around the apartment, to take responsibility. Sometimes he would do a small task, but it almost felt unfinished on purpose. He might scrub the inside of the toilet but ignore the seat. He would load the dishwasher but leave the clean dishes sitting there for several days. Without repeated reminders, almost nothing got done. It felt less like living with a partner and more like raising someone who refused to grow up. I searched everywhere for answers. Friends gave advice. Family members tried to help. My therapist suggested different approaches. I learned about communication techniques. I tried encouragement instead of criticism. I offered understanding instead of anger. I gave reassurance. I showed patience. I even helped him begin therapy because I genuinely believed professional support could make a difference. Whenever things improved, the progress lasted only a short time. Soon everything would fall back into the same exhausting routine. While I was spending all of my energy trying to keep our relationship alive, I slowly stopped taking care of myself. Some days I felt hopeful. Other days I could barely get out of bed. I didn't notice how much resentment was building inside me. It happened quietly, slowly, almost invisibly, until one day, it was everywhere. The strange part was that I wasn't alone. I had wonderful friends who cared deeply about me. My family loved me without conditions. I had a therapist who genuinely wanted to help. My medication was beginning to improve my mental health. Yet despite having all of those people supporting me, I kept pouring every ounce of energy into someone who wasn't meeting me halfway. Little by little, Dominic stopped feeling like my partner. He became a responsibility, a burden that I never admitted existed. Everything changed during a conversation in late August 2026. I was talking with a coworker. We weren't even especially close. I simply found myself venting about everything that had been happening. He listened quietly without interrupting. When I finally stopped talking, he asked one simple question. "Do you want honest advice?" I said yes. He looked directly at me and said something that completely changed my life. "You need to leave him." That was it. One sentence. No dramatic speech. No complicated explanation. Just 7 words that echoed inside my head for days. At first, those words terrified me. Leaving felt impossible. But eventually, they stopped sounding like a threat. Instead, they became a promise. A promise that life could actually become better. So I made the hardest decision I had ever made. I ended the relationship. There were tears. Mine. His. Both of us knew this chapter was ending. I packed a bag with his belongings. I helped him into an Uber that took him to a local homeless shelter because he had nowhere else to go. The next day, I bought him a ticket back to his hometown so he could reconnect with his family. He had barely spoken to them for more than a year. Only after realizing I truly meant goodbye did he finally reach out to them. Soon afterward, he found a safe place to stay. When I heard that news, every emotion I had been holding inside finally exploded. I sat at my desk at work and cried for nearly an hour. The tears simply wouldn't stop. Thankfully, I wasn't alone. My co-workers surrounded me with kindness. Some had waited nearby the night I ended the relationship because they didn't want me facing it by myself. Others filled my weekends with plans so I wouldn't isolate myself. My parents were incredible. They offered me a place to stay. They even offered to help pay for a new apartment if I wanted to leave the place Dominic and I had shared. Every single person who knew what had really happened reacted almost exactly the same way. They were relieved. Some quietly said, "Thank goodness." My mother, never one to hide her feelings, looked at me and said, "It's about time." The first weekend after the breakup was incredibly painful. I cried more than I thought was possible. But by Monday morning, something inside me had changed. For the first time in years, I felt lighter. I slowly rebuilt my life. I moved into a new home. I returned to healthy routines. I spent more time with friends. I focused on therapy again. My doctor adjusted my medication. I started talking openly about everything I had been carrying. Day after day, week after week, month after month, I became someone I barely recognized. On March 7th, 2026, I was lying in bed when tears suddenly filled my eyes. For a moment I thought I was grieving the relationship again. But I wasn't. These tears were different. I cried because I realized how much my life had changed. I no longer hated myself. I wasn't emotionally exhausted every single day. I wasn't isolating myself anymore. I had started losing weight. I was exercising, creating healthy routines, seeing friends, making plans, laughing again. For the first time in my adult life, I wasn't just surviving. I was genuinely happy. My therapy sessions became monthly check-ins instead of emergency appointments. Doctor visits became less frequent. My friendships grew stronger than ever. My relationship with my family became closer than I thought possible. I even started creating art again. Something I had completely abandoned during the relationship. When I looked back at the person I had once been, it almost felt like looking at someone else. I never believed I could become someone who actually liked the person staring back in the mirror. Looking back now, I feel overwhelming gratitude toward everyone who helped me along the way. Some offered advice. Some simply listened. Some stayed beside me in silence. Not every piece of advice made sense immediately. Sometimes I ignored it. Sometimes I resisted it. But every conversation planted a seed. Eventually, everything clicked. Every painful moment. Every sleepless night. Every tear. Every frightening decision. It was all worth it because it led me to peace. If any part of this story feels familiar, if you recognize yourself in these experiences, or if someone you love is trapped in a relationship that is slowly destroying them, please listen to the people who genuinely care about you. Sometimes the people outside the relationship can see what you cannot. Don't wait as long as I did. Because healing can begin the moment you choose yourself. Then, just when I believed that chapter of my life had finally ended, another unexpected phone call arrived. On April 3rd, 2026, at exactly 2:17 in the morning, my phone vibrated. The number wasn't saved in my contacts. Normally I would have ignored it. Something told me not to. I answered. The voice on the other end belonged to an emergency veterinary hospital. Someone had brought in a cat connected to my old contact information. The cat had likely eaten part of a lily plant. The situation was extremely serious because lilies are highly toxic to cats and can quickly cause fatal kidney damage. The veterinarian explained that treatment had to begin immediately. They needed permission. They also needed payment for emergency care. Even before hearing the owner's name, I already knew whose cat it was. Without thinking, I grabbed my hoodie with one hand while opening my banking app with the other. As I drove to the clinic, one question stayed in my mind. Is Dominic there? There was a brief silence. Then the answer came. No. He had sent the cat with a roommate because he didn't have transportation. When I arrived, the waiting room felt painfully quiet. Bright fluorescent lights filled the empty space. Inside a clear oxygen enclosure sat the frightened cat, angry, confused, and fighting to stay alive. The veterinarian carefully explained every treatment they planned to perform. Intravenous fluids, blood tests, constant monitoring, watching the kidneys around the clock. Without hesitation, I signed every form. I paid the deposit. A little after 5 in the morning, the automatic doors opened. Dominic finally walked inside. He looked different. Much thinner than I remembered. The comfortable life he once had was gone. His clothes smelled faintly of fryer oil and cheap hand soap, signs of long hours working in a kitchen. His hair was neatly flattened beneath a worn cap. When our eyes met, countless emotions crossed his face at once. Relief. Embarrassment. Regret. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might cry. Instead, he quietly said, "I didn't know lilies were dangerous." His voice cracked at the end of the sentence. He explained that the flowers belonged to his roommate's girlfriend. I nodded. "They're deadly to cats," I replied calmly. "The vets caught it early. He's getting the treatment he needs." Dominic slowly sat across from me. The silence between us felt heavy. Finally, he spoke again. "I found a job washing dishes." The words came out carefully, almost as if he wanted me to know that his life had finally started moving forward. Dominic looked down at the floor before speaking. "I work the night shift now," he said quietly, "at a diner on 6th Street. I sleep during the day." A year earlier, those words would have sounded like a heartfelt confession. I would have felt responsible for fixing everything. I would have searched for the right thing to say. This time, they sounded like simple information. Nothing more. I nodded and replied, "Okay." And for the first time, I truly meant it. There was no anger in my voice. No hope. No guilt. Just acceptance. A few minutes later, the veterinarian returned with the test results. Everyone in the room became silent. The doctor explained that the situation was serious, but there was still reason to be hopeful. The cat's kidneys had not suffered major damage yet. Because treatment had started quickly, there was still a good chance for recovery. It wasn't perfect news. But it wasn't the worst news either. We still had time. Dominic kept staring at the floor as if he couldn't bring himself to look anyone in the eye. Then one of the veterinary technicians asked an important question. "Who is the primary owner of the cat?" Without thinking, both of us answered at exactly the same time. "I am." Our voices overlapped. We looked at each other. For just a second, it felt like the past had returned. Then reality settled back in. I took a slow breath and spoke first. "It's me." Dominic lowered his head and gave a small nod. His eyes filled with tears. "I can't take care of them," he whispered. "Not the way they deserve. Not right now." Those words carried more honesty than anything he had said during the final months of our relationship. The rest of the morning passed one small moment at a time. I sent a message to my manager explaining that I would be late for work. Then I stepped outside into the parking lot. The cold morning air hit my face. I called my dad. The second he answered, I couldn't hold myself together anymore. I cried so hard that I had to cover my face with my sleeve. My hands still smelled like hospital soap and disinfectant wipes from touching the veterinary equipment. Before going back inside, I wiped my face carefully. I didn't want the frightened cat to sense my stress. Animals notice more than we realize. My father listened quietly. He didn't interrupt. When I finally stopped crying, he simply said, "I'm on my way." 20 minutes later, he arrived exactly as promised. He stepped out of his truck carrying a travel mug filled with hot coffee. He didn't give a long speech. He didn't try to solve everything. He just stood beside me. Sometimes love doesn't need words. Sometimes love is simply someone choosing not to let you face a difficult day alone. By the afternoon, the cat had started showing small signs of improvement. He hissed at one of the nurses. He growled when someone adjusted his blanket. He even tried to swat at the veterinarian through the kennel door. The entire medical team smiled. "That's actually a very good sign," one of them laughed. "He has plenty of fight left." The danger wasn't over, but everyone believed we had avoided the worst. The next morning would tell us much more. Before leaving the clinic, I arranged another day of treatment and monitoring. Then I sent Dominic a short text. "I'll stop by around 7 tonight to pick up the other cat." A few seconds later, he replied, "Okay." About a minute passed before another message appeared. "Thank you." That was all. I hadn't seen the place where Dominic was living since the day our relationship ended. The last memory I had was watching the Uber drive away. I had never looked back. Now I was about to see the life he had built without me. His new home was an old house divided into several rented rooms. Everything looked temporary. The furniture didn't match. The walls were worn. The hallway smelled faintly of old carpet and cheap cooking oil. Several people shared the living room, quietly watching football on television. When I walked in, they all looked toward the door. Nobody stared. Nobody asked questions. One of them quietly lowered the television volume without anyone saying a word. It was a small act of kindness that didn't go unnoticed. Dominic opened his bedroom door holding the second cat in his arms. The cat looked perfectly comfortable, completely unaware of how complicated the humans around him felt. "I'm sharing a room upstairs," Dominic explained. He pointed toward the second floor, but I didn't ask to see it. That chapter of my life was over. Almost nervously, he added another sentence. "I've been going to meetings." He looked at me carefully, almost waiting for those words to reopen a door that had already been closed. He scratched his arm before speaking again. "My mom calls me twice every week now." I smiled gently. "That's good." Because it really was. No matter what had happened between us, I wanted him to become healthier. I simply couldn't be the person responsible for making that happen anymore. He handed me the cat carrier. For a brief second, I saw the version of him I had loved years earlier. The memory was still there, but it no longer controlled me. He cleared his throat. "Do you think, maybe someday?" He couldn't finish the sentence. I already knew what he wanted to ask. I answered softly. "I'm really glad you're getting your life together." I paused. "But I can't be part of that journey." He closed his eyes for a moment. Then he nodded. There wasn't anything left to say. The drive home was strangely peaceful. The second cat spent almost the entire trip meowing as loudly as possible. Every red light became another tiny concert. When I looked over at him, I couldn't help laughing. For the first time in years, I felt something deep inside me finally relax. I hadn't realized how tightly I had been holding on to the past. When we reached my apartment, I carried both cats inside. Sunlight poured through the large windows and stretched across the hardwood floor. The apartment felt warm, safe, quiet. The cats immediately began inspecting every corner like tiny security guards checking a new building. Water bowls, food dishes, fresh blankets. Everything belonged to them now. The following day, the sick cat finally came home from the veterinary hospital. He walked slowly through the apartment before finding a bright patch of afternoon sunlight. He stretched his body across the warm floor. Then he started purring. Not quietly. His entire body vibrated with happiness. I sat beside him on the rug. Without warning, tears rolled down my face. These weren't desperate tears. They weren't the painful cries that leave your chest aching. They were quiet, peaceful. The kind of tears that arrive when your heart finally understands that the worst is over. The next week became a series of simple but meaningful changes. I officially transferred both veterinary records into my name. Their identification microchips were updated with my phone number. I walked through every room of my apartment looking for anything that could be dangerous. One afternoon I noticed a bouquet of flowers sitting on my kitchen counter. A neighbor had brought them over as a housewarming gift. Hidden in the middle were several lilies. Without hesitation, I threw the entire bouquet away. I wasn't willing to take any chances. Then life slowly became ordinary again. I cleaned because I wanted a clean home, not because I feared someone's reaction. I cooked healthy meals. I sang while doing the dishes. Sometimes I even danced around the kitchen with two confused cats watching me from across the room. 3 weeks after the emergency vet visit, I did something that once felt impossible. I unpacked the microphone I had bought years earlier. It had been sitting in a box collecting dust. It represented a dream I had abandoned during the hardest years of my relationship. I clipped it onto my shirt, sat down at my small desk, pressed the record button. For 10 minutes, I talked about the hidden grief that follows the end of a relationship. Not just losing the person, but losing the routines, the habits, the future you imagined, the familiar smell of someone's shampoo. The creaking floorboards you memorized without realizing it. The tiny details that disappear overnight. I ended the recording with one sentence. Lilies are poisonous to cats. And sometimes the wrong kind of love can be just as dangerous to people. Instead of uploading it online, I sent it to a local community radio station that accepted public submissions. Years earlier, I had promised myself that one day I would hear my own voice on the radio. I never forgot that promise. A few days later, they emailed me. They loved it. The recording aired on a Tuesday night at 10 o'clock. I sat quietly on my couch with one cat asleep on my lap while the other stared out the window. When my voice came through the speakers, I felt something impossible to describe. I listened to myself say, "I am happy now." No one argued. No one questioned me. No one asked me to explain why. Those 4 words simply existed. For the first time in years, they were true. My phone stayed face down on the coffee table the entire night. I didn't need anyone's approval. I didn't need validation. Somewhere across town, Dominic was probably finishing another shift at the diner. Maybe he heard the broadcast. Maybe he didn't. Either way, it no longer mattered. That realization felt like freedom. The next morning brought one final surprise. When I opened my mailbox, I found an envelope with handwriting I recognized immediately. Dominic. I carried it upstairs without opening it. For several minutes, I simply stared at it. Finally, I opened the envelope. Inside was one sheet of paper. Only 4 short paragraphs. No begging. No excuses. No attempts to win me back. He apologized for what had happened with the lilies. He explained that he had paid his roommate back for the ride to the veterinary hospital. He wrote that he hoped both cats would grow old, stubborn, and healthy. Then he ended with a simple thank you. That was all. I folded the letter carefully. Instead of throwing it away, I placed it inside the same drawer where I kept my passport and spare keys. Important things. Not because I needed them every day, but because I liked knowing they were safely put away. Then I stood up. I cleaned the stovetop. Not because anyone expected it. Not because I feared criticism. Simply because it needed cleaning. As I left for work, both cats sat proudly on the windowsill watching me with their usual judgmental expressions. I laughed. Inside the elevator, another resident smiled at me. "You look different," she said. "You look like you finally got some good sleep." I smiled back. I did. And for the first time in a very long time, I truly had. A month later, on the evening of May 18th, 2026, I stood inside a tiny radio studio that wasn't much bigger than my old college dorm room. A glowing red light above the door switched on. The room instantly became silent. Behind the glass, the volunteer sound engineer gave me a thumbs up and mouthed, "Whenever you're ready." My hands were shaking. My palms were covered in sweat. I clipped on the same microphone, took one deep breath, and began reading another story. This one was about healing. About how recovery isn't measured by huge victories. It's measured by small moments. The first night you sleep through traffic without waking up. The first meal you cook without feeling angry. The first time laughter comes naturally instead of being forced. The comforting sound of a cat purring against your chest after a long day. The broadcast was supposed to last 5 minutes. It lasted almost 7. When it ended, I removed my headphones and smiled. For the first time, sharing my story didn't reopen old wounds. It reminded me how far I had come. After the show, my friends insisted on celebrating. We walked to a small neighborhood bar that had once been an old barbershop. Since I was still taking medication, I skipped alcohol and ordered an orange soda with a tiny paper umbrella. Everyone laughed. We raised our glasses anyway. One friend smiled and said, "To new beginnings." Another added, "And to the cats." We all laughed. Music filled the room. People danced. The floor was sticky. The conversations were loud. The entire place felt wonderfully alive. When the bartender announced last call, none of us wanted the night to end. Not because we were avoiding going home, but because, for once, home was no longer something any of us were afraid to return to. Somebody suggested going to a diner. Nobody argued because there was only one diner everyone in town knew. It sat on the corner of 6th Street, glowing with bright blue and red neon lights that looked beautiful against the dark sky. The place felt old in the best way, as if it had been serving warm meals and friendly smiles for generations. When we pushed open the door, the little bell above it rang softly. Warm air wrapped around us at once. The smell of pancakes covered in syrup mixed with fresh coffee and sizzling onions. It was the kind of smell that could make anyone hungry, no matter how full they were. We squeezed into a worn-out booth with cracked red seats. Someone had covered one of the tiers with silver tape, giving it a little character instead of making it look broken. 5 of us sat shoulder to shoulder, laughing as we tried to fit comfortably. In that moment, I felt something rare, a quiet happiness. Life was simple for a while, and being surrounded by people I cared about made everything feel right. Before anyone else noticed, my eyes found Dominic. He stood behind the kitchen counter, moving quickly between steaming plates and busy cooks. One arm held 3 dishes with perfect balance while his other hand adjusted another plate beneath the warming light. His face was serious, not because he was angry, but because he was completely focused. Every movement had a purpose. He knew exactly who was waiting, which order came next, and how to keep everything moving without making mistakes. For a second, memories I thought were gone came rushing back. Then they quietly settled again. A young waitress with kind eyes and faded freckles came over to take our order. She smiled gently as she asked if we wanted pie after dinner. We couldn't decide between cherry and lemon meringue, joking back and forth about which one was better. Then everything changed. A strange sound echoed through the diner. It wasn't loud, but it immediately felt wrong. A man sitting alone at the counter suddenly grabbed his throat. His eyes grew wide with panic, and his chair scraped loudly across the floor. The spoon beside his coffee cup fell and rolled across the counter. For one long second, nobody moved. People looked at each other, waiting for someone else to react. The waitress froze. Someone quietly whispered, "Sir?" Another customer stood halfway before sitting back down again, unsure of what to do. My body reacted before my mind had time to think. I jumped from the booth and hurried toward the man. "I'm here to help," I said calmly, making sure he heard my voice before I touched him. I stood behind him and placed my hands where I had been taught during first aid training. I gave one careful thrust. Nothing happened. I adjusted my position and tried again. The man struggled to breathe. One more time. Suddenly, a piece of food shot forward and landed on the counter with a soft thud. The man gasped. It was the deepest breath he had probably ever taken. Almost instantly, the entire diner seemed to breathe with him. The silence broke. Someone clapped. Someone else sighed with relief. The waitress hurried over with napkins while the manager rushed out from the kitchen asking if anyone needed an ambulance. The man shook his head, tears filling his eyes. "I'm okay," he whispered. I smiled and gently patted his shoulder. "You're safe now." He laughed through his tears, embarrassed but grateful to be alive. The manager insisted his meal would be free that night. Nobody argued. As I stepped backward, I accidentally bumped into the glass pie display, making everyone nearby laugh, including me. It felt good. After such a frightening moment, laughter reminded us that everything was going to be all right. When I looked toward the kitchen, Dominic was still standing there. He had forgotten about the plate in his hand. His eyes met mine for only a moment. There was no anger. No sadness. Just quiet understanding. I gave him a small nod. He returned it before turning back to work. Nothing else needed to be said. Later, the waitress brought us an extra slice of lemon meringue pie. "The kitchen had an extra piece," she said with a warm smile. Maybe that was true. Maybe it was simply kindness. Either way, it tasted sweeter than any pie I had ever eaten. When the bill arrived, there was a short note written neatly across the bottom. "Take care." I folded the receipt without looking toward the kitchen. Some memories don't need another conversation. Sometimes, peace is simply walking away without carrying yesterday into tomorrow. That night, I went home tired but thankful. My 2 cats were waiting by the window as if they had been keeping watch the entire evening. They greeted me with loud meows until I laughed and picked them both up. Later, while sitting on my kitchen floor with the last bite of lemon pie, I realized something important. Saving someone's life feels extraordinary. But building a peaceful life one ordinary day at a time is its own kind of miracle. The next morning, I woke up feeling lighter. Not because the world had suddenly become perfect, but because I finally believed I could keep moving forward without looking back. Every small step mattered. Every quiet choice mattered. And for the first time in a very long time, the future felt less frightening than the past.